Jonathan's victory. In our last story, we learned of Saul's pride and disobedience. Although he claimed many victories, his attitude against God was muddied by his own pride and anxiety. Now we peer into the heart of Jonathan, Saul's son. His bravery and resolve to do what is right is contrasted against Saul's descending heart, inspired by the book of 1 Samuel. The camp of Israel was still. Preparations for battle were almost complete, and the men waited silently in their tents for orders. In his tent Saul stewed in his own self-loathing because of what Samuel had said. Would his kingdom be taken away from him so soon? Saul thought to himself. Meanwhile Saul's son Jonathan beckoned his armor-bearer and said, "Let us go over the other side of the hill to the Philistine camp. Perhaps there are weaknesses we are unaware of." So Jonathan and his servant crossed over the hill silently, for Jonathan did not desire for any attention or objections. They climbed over the rocky hill and hid under one of the crags beside a rock. There they could see the Philistine camp going about their business. The sun was making its descent, and the soldiers were getting ready for the night to fall. Jonathan peered at the Philistine garrison. There were about 20 men standing on the outskirts of the rest of the camp. He did not see them as others did. While others trembled at their numbers, Jonathan saw men too consumed with their own wickedness to fight bravely. He knew that the Lord would go before them. Jonathan and the armor-bearer crouched silently under the rock. Jonathan turned to his armor-bearer and whispered, "Perhaps God will work for us this day. If God wants victory, he shall get it. It does not matter whether it is 2 men or 2,000. His armor-bearer looked at Jonathan and nodded. "I am with you, heart and soul." The two smiled and stood upright for the Philistines to see them. They sauntered into camp, and the Philistine soldiers noticed them approaching. The Philistines were not threatened in the least by Jonathan and his servant. "Hebrews," they laughed. "Come on over here, Hebrews. We will show you around." The Philistines cackled and spat on the floor. Jonathan and the armor-bearer walked slowly. Jonathan could feel the favor of God in that place. To him it was only a matter of swinging his axe. The Lord would do the rest. "God is before us," Jonathan said, and the two leapt into the group of men. Jonathan swung his axe with decisiveness, with his armor-bearer fighting beside him. The two of them fought off the advances of 20 men. Metal clashed against metal, and Jonathan struck down every man that ran towards them. The two of them danced with their blades, and the rest of the Philistines scattered in confusion. Darkness began to settle into the sky, and all of a sudden the Philistines began to fight one another in confusion. They thought they were under attack by over 100 men, so they stumbled into each other's swords. The watchmen of Israel could see a restlessness in the Philistine camp below. They brought word to Saul, and he had his men count to see who was missing from among them. "Jonathan and his armor-bearer," they reported. So Saul rallied the rest of the army, and the entirety of Israel's army stormed the Philistine camp. The battle stretched for miles as Philistines scattered in 1,000 different directions. Confusion and hysteria overcame the Philistines, for they were caught completely off guard. Some of the surrounding villages caught word that the Philistines were running away, so they sent some of their soldiers to join the Israelite army. God had used Jonathan to scatter the Philistines, and one by one they fell at his feet. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Bethlehem. There was still a vast number of Philistines to be slain. Saul, in a rash moment of passion, gave orders for the men to not eat until every Philistine had been killed. He wanted to incentivize his soldiers, but instead he left them without fuel or energy for battle. Jonathan, however, continued to eat. He would snack on honey to replenish his energy, and then return to the battlefield for more victory. "Eat and be filled," Jonathan said to his men. "Look at me, I have eaten, and now have the strength to continue." So Jonathan had his men eat the food they found in the Philistine camp. Saul soon realized that his men were growing weaker by the hour, so he ordered for a feast to be prepared to serve the men before sending them out again to raid the Philistine cities. He discovered that Jonathan had been feasting on honey, and giving some to his men as well. Saul's pride sparked rage inside of him. "What have you done?" Saul yelled. Jonathan was breathing heavily from battle. He looked closely at his father. He was growing mad. He could see it in his eyes. Saul was becoming irresponsible, and his mind was fogged. Jonathan did not know at this time that God's favor had been removed from him. Jonathan stood up straight and said, "I ate honey." Jonathan stretched out his arms and said, "Here I am. If I must die, then so be it." Saul's brow furrowed, and his mouth tensed up with anger. He pointed to his son and said, "You shall die for it." And Saul lifted his sword to strike down his son. In that instant, the soldiers surrounded Jonathan and said, "You shall not harm one hair on his head, for he is the one who has worked out this salvation for Israel." The soldiers formed a wall between Saul and Jonathan. In that instant, Saul knew that he was no longer king. In title, yes, but he did not have the hearts of his men.